Good morning, or good afternoon, as the case may be. My name is Lisa Curtis, and I'm Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Thank you for joining us for this very special event on policy options on Afghanistan 4 years after the U.S. withdrawal. 4 years ago, almost to the day, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan collapsed, and the Taliban retook power in the country after the 20-year U.S.-led NATO mission to stabilize the country and support the elected government. This extraordinarily painful moment is seared into all our memories, and the people of Afghanistan are still suffering from the consequences of this poorly planned and executed U.S. withdrawal from the country. While the second Trump administration has levied strong criticism of the Biden administration for the chaotic withdrawal, we are still waiting to see a defined, coherent policy approach to Afghanistan that would protect vital U.S. counterterrorism goals, as well as the rights of women and girls, the foundation for which the United States painstakingly invested for 2 decades. Some argue that the U.S. has no responsibility toward Afghan women and girls who are now denied education, jobs, freedom of movement, and even the ability to speak up in public. But they are wrong. The U.S. educated and empowered an entire generation of Afghan women and girls. Turning our backs on them now as they face increasingly repressive and cruel Taliban policies would be shameful. It also would be short-sighted and counterproductive toward our broader national security objectives. As I wrote in recent congressional testimony, ignoring what is happening to Afghan women will only facilitate the Taliban's efforts to radicalize society and foster a socioeconomic environment conducive to the growth of extremism and terrorism. Having served in the first Trump administration, I can attest to the fact that President Trump's closest advisors prioritized support for Afghan women and girls. In 2017, former White House senior advisor Ivanka Trump facilitated the visit of an all-girls Afghan robotics team to the United States to participate in an international robotics competition. In 2018, while speaking at a conference on women's empowerment held in Kazakhstan, Ivanka Trump said, "Supporting women's empowerment is therefore fundamental to the future direction of Afghanistan. The status and disposition of women will determine whether Afghanistan will be a civilized member of the community of nations or will dissolve back into an oppressive and brutal society like that which we saw during the previous Taliban rule." That was Ivanka Trump in 2018. Now, thankfully, the second Trump administration recently decided to continue U.S. assistance for online education and scholarships for Afghan women to study abroad. This is smart policy. The more Afghan women and girls that can access educational opportunities, the lesser the chance that extremist trends in Afghan society that fuel terrorism will flourish and grow. So what are the other smart policies and strategies the second Trump administration can pursue when it comes to Afghanistan? While it may no longer be a top foreign policy priority, Afghanistan still merits close U.S. attention. The ISIS-K threat in Afghanistan has become an increasingly global concern, especially since ISIS-K claimed 2 major attacks in 2024, one in Moscow and one in Iran. ISIS-K operatives plotting attacks in the West have also been arrested in Europe and the United States, and U.S. officials have raised concerns about ISIS-K's capabilities and intent to continue to target the United States. While the Taliban also opposes ISIS-K and has been fighting the group and eliminating some of its senior operatives, we should not deceive ourselves into thinking that the Taliban can be our counterterrorism partners. After all, the Taliban remains allied with al-Qaeda. The February 6, 2025 United Nations Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team report said the Taliban, quote, maintained a permissive environment allowing al-Qaeda to consolidate with the presence of safe houses and training camps scattered across Afghanistan, end quote. So to discuss these complex and important issues, we have a very distinguished panel of experts. Joining us today is Richard Bennett, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Afghanistan. Mr. Bennett previously served as the Chief of the Human Rights Service with the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, or UNAMA, and as the representative of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and head of the human rights components of peacekeeping operations in Sierra Leone, Timor-Leste, and South Sudan, as well as serving twice in Afghanistan, 2003 to 2007 and 2018 to 2019. He also worked for Amnesty International. Next, we have Mr. David Sedney. He served as president of the American University of Afghanistan from 2019 to 2021 and was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. He also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia from 2007 to 2009, was Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing from 2004 to 2007, and was Deputy Chief of Mission in Kabul from 2003 to 2004. Next, we have Ms. Metra Mehran. She is the Gender and Policy Advisor for the Strategic Litigation Project at the Atlantic Council. Hailing from Afghanistan, she has earned recognition as a finalist for the 2021 European Parliament's Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought, marking her as a prominent figure in the global pursuit of human rights. Ms. Mehran also co-founded the Feminine Perspective movement, offering a platform for women across Afghanistan to advocate for their fundamental rights during intra-Afghan peace negotiations. So we'll start with you, Richard. Before the Trump administration's drastic aid cuts, the United States had provided about 40% of the total humanitarian support for Afghans. Since January, however, the U.S. has cut about $500 million in assistance, including for the World Food Program. The WFP says it can currently only meet the needs of 1 million of the 10 million Afghans who require urgent food aid. What can you tell us about the humanitarian situation? What is your greatest concern when it comes to humanitarian issues in Afghanistan?
Thank you, Lisa, for the question, and even more so for inviting me on this very distinguished panel. And thank you, CNAS, for hosting this event on the cusp of a very grim 4th anniversary of the US withdrawal and of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan again. I think when we're talking about the humanitarian situation, we're also talking about fundamental rights issues, the right to life, to education, to healthcare, to work, to equality, and to dignity, and especially for Afghan women and girls. I think my greatest concern is the growing gap between the scale of the needs in Afghanistan and the rapidly shrinking international response. The US was the biggest donor, but it is not the only donor that has cut. And according to the UN, this year, some 23 million people were in need of humanitarian assistance. As of yesterday, the UN humanitarian response plan to deal with the crisis was just 25.8% funded. And funding cuts have had a significant impact on the humanitarian response. Just a few examples. This year, 420 health facilities have been forced shut. The same goes for around 300 nutrition sites. And this does not even take into account the current crisis of mass returns of Afghan nationals, including refugees from Iran and Pakistan. According to UNHCR figures last week, 2.1 million have returned or been forced to return to Afghanistan from these two countries. These are staggering numbers contributing to significant needs on the ground, and which are already stretched, where the humanitarian resources are already stretched and struggling to meet. And those needs include emergency shelter and housing, food assistance, which you mentioned already, water, sanitation and hygiene, livelihood support, and cash assistance. I've mentioned already the way in which the cuts are affecting not just the humanitarian situation, but education and economic empowerment initiatives, long-term health care, including mental, psychological, sexual and reproductive care, journalism, media reporting, human rights documentation and advocacy, and other work led by Afghan organizations that are independent of the Taliban and form a key resistance to the regime, especially women-led organizations. Regrettably, the regime itself is unlikely to be responsive to the suffering of its people, including if pressed by the West, of which it's suspicious. And a better option may come through pressure from Islamic institutions and countries in the region. And all of this said, humanitarian aid is for the short-term, life-saving, acute situations, not suitable or appropriate for the long term. And here's the conundrum. Afghanistan needs development so it can become less dependent on aid, but this would require very careful management so as to avoid further and empowering and entrenching the Taliban regime. Finally, poverty, employment, lack of education are a toxic mix that is likely to fuel violent extremism. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It is a grim, anniversary indeed. And just hearing about all those challenges after so much investment from the U.S. and so many other countries is really devastating. And I think we can't state enough the need for a policy from the United States and for other countries to be able to stem this crisis that is unfolding. Metra, I want to turn to you. Richard talked about the humanitarian crisis. He touched on human rights issues. I'm wondering if you can tell us what's happening on the issue of women's rights. And I want to, ask you in particular about your extremely important, impactful work in seeking to codify the Taliban's treatment of women. The fact that this is the only country in the world that is denying women an education, not allowing them to work, not even allowing them to speak up in public. Things are getting worse and worse as time moves on. But your efforts to try to brand this as gender apartheid, why is this so important in the effort to try to improve the situation for Afghan women?
Thank you, Lisa. I'm really honored to be here, and thank you for the very timely and important event. We are on eve of August 15, the dark day where everything turned overnight dark for women and girls, mainly, and people of Afghanistan. After 4 years, as time passed, Taliban are getting more institutionalized and systematic in enforcing their discrimination and totalizing operation system against the people of Afghanistan. From education to work to freedom of speech, freedom of movement, every right that we as human are entitled to have and practice are denied and stripped away by the Taliban from women and girls in Afghanistan. Which unfortunately has reached to the threshold of dehumanization. And as the time passes, everything gets more institutionalized and it's getting enforced unanimously across Afghanistan. So beyond, for example, primary school education is banned for women, and you don't see any school open across Afghanistan. Of course, women are resisting, and they are running some underground schools. But with this come a lot of psychological tool that we are seeing high rates of suicide and extremely the worst situation of trauma and pain that women are going through. And everything that I sometimes I speak about it. I'm in at the end. I'm like, how we can fathom this level of atrocity that Taliban are committing against women and girls in Afghanistan, and we are not taking the action the situation deserves. To respond to that, the first thing I think is we should name what's happening in Afghanistan, and that is important for me. What Taliban are doing against women and girls in Afghanistan are not any mere cultural religious act. It's political and institutionalized, and with a very clear intention of sustaining their regime. For that purpose, there is a gap in international law that cannot. There is no law that can encompass the totality of the crime that's happening in Afghanistan. Of course, we have gender persecution. We are trying ICJ. Richard's mandate is extremely important, but complementary to everything else that's happening. We are pushing that the situation should be named and recognized as gender apartheid, so it can encompass the totality and the type of the crime and atrocities Taliban are committing against women and girls in Afghanistan to address the situation. One of the options that I am involved in pushing for is codifying gender apartheid within the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty. And I think 14th of August is a good reminder that I call on everyone globally, and if people, regardless of where they are, that hear us, that it's the time that we all mobilize and stand in solidarity with women of Afghanistan, because I think the level of atrocities happening in the country surpass any excuse, and I think it or any threshold that can that we should be anyone should be okay with it. So that's why I think the level of atrocities happening, the totalizing oppression and subjugation Taliban are perpetrating against women and girls in Afghanistan it should be recognized and codified as a crime within international law. I think later I will come and speak how this is not gonna remain and stay inside Afghanistan only, and how they are socially engineering the society through education and madrasification are changing everything.
Well, thank you. And thank you for your steadfast efforts. That is very important. And hopefully we'll see the process completed soon, because this is extremely important to name what the Taliban is doing and to continue to keep that in the consciousness of the world and the global community, so that the women are not forgotten. David, I want to turn to you. You previously served as president of American University of Afghanistan. Thank you for your service. And it was such a relief to learn at the end of June that the Trump administration would indeed continue to fund this vital institution. And I know you put a lot of work into that effort. And so congratulations that positive decision was made. How do you think that Secretary Rubio was convinced about the importance of AUAF and the need for it to stay open? Of course, AUAF is now located in Doha, Qatar. The Qatari government has been very supportive for that institution, and it educates all Afghans, of course, but women, are a big part of that. And do you take this positive development as a sign that we might see more helpful changes in the administration's approach to Afghanistan? And I would like to bring in the issue of Afghan refugees here. Of course, there's been tremendous protest and frustration, particularly among American veteran communities, with the treatment of Afghan refugees and the halt to the United States Refugee Assistance Program, which has impacted thousands of Afghans globally. President Trump acknowledged the difficulties of about 1,000 Afghan refugees located in Doha, saying he wanted to help that situation, which I think is a step in the right direction. But where do you think the Trump administration is also going on the issue of Afghan refugees?
Well, you've asked a lot. Let me first thank you and CNAS for this opportunity to discuss these very important issues with such a great group of people here. I want to start by saying that regards to AUAF, the administration decision to me was very bittersweet, with a very accent on bitter. We are a tiny, tiny part of what the U.S. was doing for Afghanistan, and a huge amount, as detailed by Richard Bennett, that was going to the humanitarian assistance that's necessary for the survival and health of hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And that decision to cut all that pales in significance to what they did for AUAF, which I'm told it.
David, can you speak up a little bit? We're having trouble hearing you.
Okay, maybe I'll move closer to the mic. Did you hear the part about bittersweet?
Can you continue after you said bittersweet?
Yes, I said the decision was bittersweet with the accent on bitter, because the amount that the AUAF gets is a tiny amount of what the U.S. government was spending on Afghanistan. The cutting of everything else, leaving hundreds of thousands, millions of people in danger of starvation, lack of medical care. AUAF, as much as I'm committed to it, pales in comparison to that. That said, I don't think that the decision on AUAF portends any major change in policy towards Afghanistan. I think, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, the screen went blank. But I think it is reflective of the fact that Afghanistan policy, as you said before, is secondary to other issues. And in this case, there are twin issues here. One is the U.S. relationship with Doha, which is overwhelmingly governed right now by the issue of Palestine and Gaza and the role that Qatar is playing there. The U.S., the fact that UAE is located physically in Doha, I think played a role in that. Secondarily, you alluded to before the fact that there are many, several thousands of Afghans that the U.S. has moved into Doha with the expectation that we would be able to move them to the U.S. And then for various reasons, we've not been able to admit them to the U.S. This group of people that is now in a camp in Doha is a huge problem, because the government of Qatar is not going to let them out into the Qatari population. So President Trump, as you mentioned before, has said they are looking for solutions for those people. They'd have to go to other countries. Nobody wants them sent back to Afghanistan. So AUAF, I think, can play a small role in this. And the U.S. government is interested in facilitating their relationship with Qatar, as long as Qatar is playing a positive role in relating to Palestine. So again, that's, I think, the bigger issue, the AUAF, that lies behind this, not any change in policy towards Afghanistan. On the issue of refugees, I would draw a distinction between those refugees who qualify for special immigrant visas, who worked in support of U.S. military and other activities, and there's a special program for them. That program has continued. When President Trump banned the entry of all Afghan passport holders to the U.S., there's an exception made for people who are moving under the SID program. So that exception came up. I understand, but I have to caution that my understanding of what goes on in the Trump administration is very limited. But there was strong lobbying from veterans groups who were supportive of President Trump in many other ways, but found that his refusal to, the danger that this program might stop, was something that they were very committed to. So I think President Trump has been responsive to the veterans program for veterans interest groups for his domestic policy, and he's responsible to Qatar on broader geopolitical issues. But whether that will mean any changes for Afghanistan writ large is another question, and we maybe can get into that because I think the Pakistan-India dynamic plays a big role there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for raising that, David. The importance of, yes, the SIV applicants, extremely important and deserve support. And we see the American veteran community stepping up, supporting them. But there are also, P1, P2 applications, human rights workers whose lives would be at danger if they're forced back to Afghanistan. Can you imagine sending young girls back to Afghanistan who, have no hope for the future whatsoever, no hopes for education, employment, rights of any kind? Metra, I don't know if you want to jump in here, because I know you also work on the Afghan refugee issue and supporting human rights workers in particular and women in particular. Do you want to jump in here at all?
Thank you, Lisa. I briefly wanted to mention that U.S., especially addressing the issue of U.S. allies who are stuck or in limbo in Pakistan, UAE, Qatar, some of them are in Poland, few are in Albania. Those were asked by the U.S. government to move to the third country to be processed because U.S. doesn't have an active presence in Afghanistan, an embassy. Now they are at risk of deportation from there. The Taliban knows that they have been moved by U.S. to some of those camps, and it directly put them at risk of persecution. The other and most important aspect is the female principal applicants of P1 and P2s who are at risk of imminent persecution by the Taliban because of their activism, because of their protests, because of all the labeling of Western or American Taliban has put on them. If they go, they are at risk of persecution. But through the work we do, some of them who are in limbo in Pakistan, for example, are suffering the compounded impact of the refugee ban in the US, because now the Pakistani government is trying to deport them. They are at risk of sexual harassment, many sort of bribes. The governments are not extending their visas. So it's very important that we also focus on the female principal applicants and their children who are alone in these third countries and going through a lot in limbo. The other thing is some of the refugee camps, especially the ones in Doha and Dubai, UAE, was created in coordination with the US government. So it's US government responsibility. And we need to highlight those issues to make sure to be addressed.
Yeah, I think people were quite shocked when TPS, temporary protective status, was withdrawn for some 12,000 Afghans currently in the United States. And part of the justification from the Department of Homeland Security was that the situation was normal and fine, and they face no dangers going back to Afghanistan, which is completely false. So, yeah, very, very disturbing development there. Richard, I want to come back to women and girls and ask you, based on your experience and background, what is it going to take? What kind of tools can the international community employ beyond what Metra has talked about in terms of the gender apartheid efforts? What can the international community do to press the Taliban on the issue of women's and girls' rights, especially when it comes to education?
Thank you, Lisa. I just like to start off by following on from David and Metra to say I follow this issue as well. The issue of Afghans who are stranded in third countries at risk of being pushed back. My recommendation is that the US should meet its responsibilities to those who have been issued with SIVs or P1s and P2s. Yesterday morning, I was woken by a woman calling me at 5 a.m. In Pakistan because she was being arrested from a GIZ, a German-run guest house, taken to what's called the Haji camp and being deported with her family. This happens too often. I'm sure that Metra gets similar calls. And there are women in touch with me every day in Pakistan who have SIVs who are also worried about being sent back to Afghanistan. It is not a safe country. UNAMA issued, the UN mission in Afghanistan issued a report last week noting how there is evidence, there are many instances of Afghans who have been forcibly returned being persecuted, harmed by the Taliban. So I agree with you completely, Lisa. On to the rest of the question. It's a complex and multifaceted crisis in Afghanistan, and there's no one tool that is going to fix it. It requires a kind of comprehensive range of interventions, which I've been calling an all tools approach, to maximize the potential for the emergence ultimately of a safe, stable, and inclusive Afghanistan. The strategy should include sustained and principled international pressure, including the establishment of clear human rights benchmarks for engagement with the Taliban, making it clear that there should be or will be no normalization of the Taliban de facto authorities unless and until there are demonstrable improvements in human rights, especially for women and girls. Second, we should ensure international accountability. Metra has already highlighted the need to codify gender apartheid, and I'm supporting that campaign, as she knows. We note that the International Criminal Court is investigating Afghanistan and has recently issued 2 arrest warrants for the top Taliban leader and the Chief Justice and ideologue as well. And we welcome that and want to see more. We also hope that it will be possible to exercise arrest warrants. There's a potential case at the International Court of Justice. Some countries have initiated an action to litigate against Afghanistan for its failures to abide by the convention, the UN Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women. And there is a clause in that convention that enables this to be taken to the ICJ. There is also a move within the Human Rights Council to establish a long-term investigation mechanism, something like the ones that exist already for Syria and Myanmar, that can be putting together case files for future prosecution, assisting both the ICC, other international courts, and universal jurisdiction. There are also other opportunities. There will be a hearing of the Permanent People's Tribunal. This is a less formal opportunity, but nonetheless an important one, which civil society organizations of Afghans have initiated. Their case has been accepted, and the first hearing will be in October. And then turning more to the US, I think more attention should be given to the application of the Magnitsky Act, which has potential for holding human rights violators to account. And maybe the Americans on the panel might want to comment on that further. We need strength and support for civil society. We need full funding for the humanitarian response for Afghanistan, as I mentioned before. It's also incredibly important to expand education and economic empowerment opportunities, especially for women, for meaningful inclusion of women's rights, women's voices, and their presence in all discussions processes relating to Afghanistan, including the process that's taking place in Doha. Mr. Sedney mentioned Doha, but this is another process that is taking place in that country, which is coordinated by the UN. It's always important to have women and other Afghans of diverse backgrounds, professional backgrounds, ethnic, religious backgrounds included in order to create a proper platform for a future for Afghanistan. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was really a comprehensive response. And, you know, I wrote down your words, sustained and principled process with the Taliban, engaging with the Taliban that has benchmarks that, you know, there absolutely should not be any normalization, any steps toward normalization with the Taliban until they have shown progress on human rights, particularly women's issues. And, you know, the hope is the second Trump administration will stick by this policy. I think the Biden administration did adhere to that policy. And, you know, thank you for mentioning the Magnitsky Act. That is an important tool that the United States has. The Biden administration had sanctioned 2 senior Taliban leaders who they saw as responsible for the policy to deny girls, Afghan girls, education. So yes, certainly these are tools that we can use. So thank you for talking about all the steps that the international community is taking, and that, you know, the U.S. Should be leading on and participating in. And we hope to see that in the future. Metra, I want to turn back to you. Reports indicate that 23,000 new madrasas have been established in Afghanistan in the last 3 years. And given the lack of educational opportunity for Afghan girls, some have chosen to attend these madrasas. But can you talk about the impact, the likely impact of these tens of thousands of madrasas on the next generation of Afghans and what it's going to do to society and the country at large?
Thank you. So what Taliban are doing, as I mentioned before, trying to do social engineering of the Afghanistan society in a way that their regime can survive and thrive. And the only way is if everyone get aligned with the way they think and their ideology. That's why what's happening with madrasification is, yes, they are not allowing girls to go to school. They are allowing some of those girls to go to madrasas, but they are teaching their ideology, the supremacist ideology, to the boys and men who are attending the madrasas. They have changed the curriculum. What it makes is, I think, the trajectory it's set on the life of women and girls and people of Afghanistan. We won't be able to reverse it for decades to come. How they are strategically working on it. So that's why one of the main things that during the process of codification we study and analyze the situation in Afghanistan is the intention of that crime. And the main intention, of course, in the case of Afghanistan for the Taliban is the sustainability of their regime and how they are changing that. The second thing that we see in this process of madrasification is, of course, they are, as I said before, the oppression and subjugation of women are pragmatically and technically and ideologically existential for the regime. So what they are doing in public spaces through the soldiers, or they call muhtasibin, we can say the morality police of Ministry of Vice and Virtue, control the women in public spaces. They orbitally arrest them, imprison them, and even torture them. They threaten and even punish the family members to make sure that women are aligned with those rules, if their dresses are not proper or if they don't have the mahram. Through madrasification, what also they do is they control the private space of the woman, even inside their houses, through those teachings on how they tell the man to treat and control the women. The other thing that recent research, some of the Afghan researchers have published a series of research that shows, interestingly, the madrasas, that the curriculum is very extremist, supremacist, ideologically focused. But meantime, they have mandatory 2 hours of English and computer classes, which it can create a global threat in the long run, because they are not only educating them to focus on Afghanistan, but also how they can, treat and see and target countries and places outside Afghanistan. So those are the important things. And that's why it's always so important that Richard mentioned the Magnitsky Act. And what I'm also pushing for and asking the US government is one of the US government foreign policy on Afghanistan is, they say, still under review. I hope we see something there that is more women rights and human rights focused. But meantime, if there are any engagement on counterterrorism and if there is any engagement on security and intelligence with the Taliban, Congress should monitor properly using the Leahy Law to ensure any engagement with Afghanistan doesn't support and fund the Taliban forces and their terrorist activism and actors.
Thank you, Metra. And I'm going to ask David to expound on this terrorism issue. But I just have to say, listening to you, Metra, it just reminds me, I've been following this region for 30 years. I always talk about how my first posting in Pakistan in 1994, about a month after I arrived in September 1994, we were learning about a new group called the Taliban who was rolling into Kandahar, Afghanistan, led by then Interior Minister of Pakistan, Nasirullah Babar. And of course, we saw the buildup and the result, which was 9/11. So I feel like we're coming full circle. We're seeing the reestablishment of these madrasas that teach this backward ideology, which is very dangerous and leads to extremism and terrorism against the United States and the West. And it really is troubling. And we need to make sure that the United States is paying attention to what's happening in Afghanistan right now. With that, David, I want to turn to you. You've had a lot of experience in the U.S. government dealing with the terrorism challenges in the region. And I want to get your thoughts on how does the U.S. deal with this now that we no longer have troops on the ground in Afghanistan, nor do we have, military partners, Afghan military partners that we can actually trust on these issues. And I know you recently testified before the Afghanistan War Commission, and you made some interesting remarks about Pakistan military and what it knew or didn't know about Osama bin Laden and his whereabouts in Abbottabad. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on Pakistan's role here, what its current relationship with the Taliban is, and how will this impact terrorism trends in the region?
Certainly. The statement that you allude to was made when I said that I agreed with Carlotta Gall, the New York Times reporter, who wrote a book about the Pakistan relationship, and in which she said that she had gotten credible information that the top leadership of Pakistan knew about and supported the Osama bin Laden's presence in Abbottabad. That's a matter now for historians. But it does show, I believe, the willingness of the Pakistani leadership, and by that I mean the military leadership, the civilian leadership is really irrelevant, to play many games at the same time. Right now, the Pakistanis are riding high because of their endorsement, their nomination of President, riding high in terms of the relations with the U.S. because of their nomination of President Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize. That got them great standing in the White House, dinner, or rather a lunch at the White House with the Army Chief of Staff, and of course helped sour relations with India in a major way. And I think we have to look at the relationship with Pakistan in that context. The India-Pakistan relationship is, I think, the most important governing area regarding Afghanistan. The Indian outreach to the Taliban, their plus up of their embassy in Kabul, their kicking out of the Republic ambassador, installing of Taliban representatives at the embassy in Delhi, and the increasing reports that the Indians are supporting both the Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban and the Baluch separatist from bases in Afghanistan, all show that the old dynamic of India, Pakistan, affecting, maybe perhaps even governing how Afghanistan is going to be able to proceed. I don't think the U.S. can play a major role in that. What we should do is avoid tilting to one side or the other, and I think the current tilt to Pakistan is bad for that. In terms of the Pakistan relationship with the Taliban, I think this is a long-standing geopolitical issue. It goes back really several hundred years, certainly more recently to 1948 and Afghanistan's vote against Pakistan's admission to the United Nations. Many, many Afghans believe that Pakistan up to the Indus River should be part of Afghanistan. No Afghan government, republic, or Taliban can say anything to really stop that or to oppose that. And so that conflict is going to continue no matter who rules Afghanistan. And the Pakistani authorities thought they could manage the Taliban better on this issue, and they've not been able to. The continued border skirmishes, the support of the Afghan Taliban for the Pakistani Taliban, I think need to be seen in that context. This is going to happen regardless of who governs Afghanistan, and the United States really should, I think, try and stay out of that. In terms of what the United States might do, I think one thing the United States could do would be to appoint somebody to look at not just Afghanistan and itself, but Afghanistan, India, Afghanistan, Pakistan. The current fact that we don't have a real special envoy for Afghanistan anymore, I think downgrades our ability to interact with other countries. And then finally, the most important thing we shouldn't do is to follow Russia's lead and decide that any nascent or potential cooperation with the Taliban against Daesh, ISIS, is so important that we should reach out to the Taliban. I think that was a mistake by Russia, and the United States would make that mistake even worse if we followed the advice of some in our intelligence community who are pushing that view right now. We should not engage with the Taliban just on that issue, because as Richard and Metra pointed out, we have much more important interests at play there that would be devalued if we did that.
Thank you, David. Very important statement. Pakistan thought it could manage the Taliban better than it's actually been able to. I think that is definitely being borne out. Something I think that the United States, recognized. A lot of people recognize that, but here we are, and we have a very complicated situation in the region, and I think your advice is well taken. Okay, I want to turn to the audience to get their questions. There are several questions coming in, but before we go to audience questions, and just to let the audience know, if you want to join the chat or ask a question, use the chat box on cnas.org/live. I think it's on your screen right now, or hashtag CNAS 2025. But first, I want to ask each panelist just to give your best, 1 to 2 ideas for how the Trump administration can improve its current approach to Afghanistan. And since we just heard from David, Richard, let's start with you.
Thank you, Lisa. So I guess my first, I think I'm probably going to reiterate some of the points I've made earlier. But my first point, I think, would be don't do more harm than has been done already. Whatever the US policy is, should take into account that Afghanistan is not a safe place to send people who worked alongside and supported US interests. Another issue of doing no harm is don't let Afghans starve in Afghanistan. In very blunt terms, but restore the humanitarian aid in a way that it reaches the people, is properly monitored, and doesn't empower or entrench the Taliban. I'll come to the normalization piece as my kind of second basket of recommendations. And David just talked about this a little as well. Don't normalize, legitimize a rogue criminal regime. I've mentioned already, that its two top leaders are indicted. There are arrest warrants from the International Criminal Court. And I know the US is not party to that, but other countries are, and I think it is significant. And the Magnitsky Act and its sanctions is also highly relevant for that. And overall take steps to reduce the possibility of radicalization and terrorism while respecting human rights, learn from history, don't repeat it. And I would say that, I am promoting, and I think others on the panel have talked about a principled and coordinated strategy. And there is no conflict between upholding principles and serving US interests, whether they are interests economically, immigration, or security. The two can go together. In fact, they are much more likely to align than not align. Thank you.
Thank you. That's just great. Metra.
Thank you. So the first and most important thing, echoing everything Richard said, is one thing that we all should, and this government should understand is what's happening in Afghanistan is a gendered issue, a women's issue. And then ignoring women's presence and not consulting them in any policy cause the policy to not be effective and work in Afghanistan. That's one thing. As the U.S. foreign policy is under review, as they say, I think it's a good opportunity to ensure that it's principled, transparent, inclusive, and accountable. So that I think the spatial inclusivity, accountability, and transparency were the issues that we missed in the past, and it should be reflected in that policy. And that's not going to happen without meaningful participation and consultation of women of Afghanistan who have been the frontline defiance actually in the past few years. And I think it's the right time and the right thing for the youth government and any other governments to ensure that they recognize their political agency. Sometimes it's annoying. They say there is no political opposition for the Taliban, and I'm like, yeah, there are military resistance that are should be respected and consulted, and equally in a very more powerful way, there are women groups who are resisting against Taliban, and they are not speaking about the women's right only but they're addressing all the issues related to Afghanistan. The other most important thing, Women, Peace and Security Act, which was actually became a public law under Trump administration in the first round. So it's really important that this administration consider that and also both Congress monitor it and hopefully the administration adopted when they are working and engaging in anything related to Afghanistan. The other thing is, I think previously I mentioned to the Leahy law, because whatever is happening in terms of security and others with Afghanistan, hopefully human rights organizations and also Congress ensure that it's monitored properly and it's implemented by the administration. And lastly, and most important thing is the women lead civil society organization and other human rights organization run by women of Afghanistan underground, either inside or who are working in exile outside Afghanistan, or diaspora groups who are doing documentation and accountability work. I think it's very important that they are funded and supported. And lastly, on the refugees, the TPS should be redesignated as soon as possible, because deportations, yes, a lot of Afghans who are here will get deported, but we have a lot of young American daughters who have been, or girls who have been born in here and who are American citizens, will be at risk of deportation with their parents too. And then if they go back, they will lose all opportunities of going to school. And that is not the right thing. And the number is, I think, a significant number of children who've been born in the past 4 years with the TPS status who are American citizens, and that will put them at risk too. So those are the issues I think it's very important that we be aware of before taking any action.
Thank you. Yeah, one can't even imagine U.S. citizens being sent back to Afghanistan, girls who can't even attend school, and being persecuted by the Taliban. It's really horrible to even consider. And thank you for raising the Women, Peace and Security Act, a very important piece of legislation that was championed, supported, and passed during the first Trump administration. And the law needs to be followed, even in the case of Afghanistan. Okay, I want to give David, if you have anything you want to add. You've already added a lot, but do you want to add any ideas of policies that the Trump administration support?
Two quick things. We should work more closely with the Central Asian countries, both on the counterterrorism areas and also on political and humanitarian issues. So we should do that. Secondly, we should, maybe Congress could take the lead in this, reinstitute the CARES program, which Secretary Rubio got rid of in his State Department reorganization. It was one of the best programs the State Department had running. It took care of a lot of the problems that the SIVs and others had. And I think putting that program back together would help address the huge delays that Richard was talking about, the SIV program. And then, of course, we should reinstate the P1, P2 process. But under this administration, I don't have much hope for that.
Thank you. Okay, we have just a few minutes for questions from the audience. We have several. I think, okay, I'll ask two of the questions and then give you each one an opportunity to respond to either one or both of them. So Miranda asks, what does the United States stand to gain from investment in and engagement with Afghanistan today? So if you can address that, I think we have been addressing it the past hour, but maybe some quick points there. And then I'll ask Jessica. Jessica's question is, what, if anything, could the U.S. have done differently during the course of its 20-year engagement that might have fundamentally enabled it to better attain its strategic goals for the U.S., Afghans, and international community? Of course, we have the Afghanistan War Commission, which is embarked on answering that question. And it's a very long answer, but if any of you have any quick thoughts on either of those questions, why should we care now? What could we have done differently when we did invest in Afghanistan for 20 years? Does anybody want to volunteer to go first? Richard, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I'm on mute.
Oh,
sorry, I'm having problems with my mute button, but yeah, I'm just grinning because you're going to the non-American resident first on this. I think I'll start with the second one and then come back to the first one, if I may. What could the US have done differently? I mean, I think we've already talked about the chaotic withdrawal. But the lead up to that was a Doha process that resulted in an agreement between the US and the Taliban, who were then fighting as an insurgent group that did not include consultation with either the people of Afghanistan or even the government of Afghanistan. After which there was a kind of in my view, peace talks that were doomed to fail from the beginning. And I think that the approach of appeasing the Taliban has led to the current situation. And I know that there were Americans dying and soldiers from other countries, as well as civilians, and many Afghans. But the formula that led us to the current position, I think, was mistaken, and that could have been done differently. There's also, secondly, a lot of concern that U.S. support, including funding, was not well used, that there was fraud, that there was corruption. And I'm not talking about now. I'm talking, I mean, it's probably continuing now, but it permeated the Republic. And the Republic did some great things. And we talked about in educating and empowering women, but it was also a mixed bag. And I think that that could have been done differently. There should have been investment, but it should have been investment that was managed differently. The first question about kind of, why care? I think the bottom line is, if we look at the US's overall kind of foreign policy kind of mantra, which is making the US safer, stronger, and more prosperous, I think that if US does not care about Afghanistan, it will deliver the opposite of all that. It will make the US more vulnerable to terrorism, less safe, and while the economic benefits may not be immediate, I think it's important to think longer term about a country in Central and South Asia which has been strategically significant and which has enormous trade potential and resource potential, mineral resource potential, in the longer term. It's been, it's been called the Great Game. There's a reason for that. It's partly because of the geopolitical situation of Afghanistan. It is not an insignificant, marginalized, small country over the horizon that the US can forget about. That will come back to bite. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I'm glad you raised the Doha Agreement. I couldn't agree with you more on the failures of that agreement between the US and the Taliban. In fact, I wrote an essay about 4 years ago for the Hoover Institution titled "How the Doha Agreement Guaranteed U.S. Failure in Afghanistan." So I think that's a very important part of the story that a lot of people don't understand. And thank you for those comments. Metra, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, maybe it's we are on the eve of August 15, 4th anniversary, so it's a good reminder of what happened on 9/11, and it was not just out of nowhere. It's U.S. beyond Cold War just left the Taliban the way they were, totally cut the the relationship, or stop prioritizing the Afghanistan as an issue, and then they harbor the terrorism. And we spoke about the madrasification. They are creating another safe haven, and there are numerous reports on the relationship of Taliban with Al Qaeda and other terrorist group in Afghanistan. That threat can be as imminent as 2001, and that can be as true and as real as 2001. And we shouldn't forget that. So now it's another mistake. The second thing is, I think those principles of inclusivity, transparency, and accountability that I spoke about, those are very important. That was what caused Doha to fail, because we were not engaged. U.S. government was not transparent on how they are engaging, where they are going, till they signed the agreement with the Taliban. And I think in relation to that accountability, when I wanted to say in response to that question, which is very important, is the transitional justice. The U.S. government preferred peace over justice in Afghanistan. In 2001, when they came and supported creation of a new government, they didn't allow us to process the accountability processes. So there were so many grievances internally for us to process too, that didn't happen. And instead of allowing us to process our grievances through the accountability mechanisms, that lead to a conflict. So what's happening now, and I think the right thing to do now, even if U.S. government want to engage or invest on anything to Afghanistan, is engage fully the people and listen to the people of Afghanistan, mainly women. But second and most important thing is allow us, not allow us, we will do it, we are doing, but then support the accountability mechanism and processes in Afghanistan, and allow it to pave the platform for anything that comes ahead. If it's a transition to another government or anything, I think the all tools approach that Richard mentioned, that is important, the documentation of it, and all other mechanisms that we are trying to leverage and utilize for Afghanistan, the U.S. government should support. And I think that is going to be the most important thing for a political or peace settlement that can be sustainable in the long run. And then repeating, I think, Richard, the only way for U.S. to be stronger and more prosperous and safer is if human rights globally are maintained. And Afghanistan in the region, for the geographical location of it, is going to be one of the key countries in determining that in terms of foreign policy. So.
Okay, thank you, Metra. We're already over time, but David, I do want to give you an opportunity, given your vast experience. Anything you quickly want to add here?
I think I just want to stress on the modification issue. The 9/11 bombers were educated in Saudi extremist schools in the 1980s because of a bad decision by the Saudi government to essentially allow extremist religious clerics to run their educational system for poorer people. So what's happening in those madrasas today may show up on U.S. footstep 20 years from now. That's something that's very hard for American policy to deal with, a long-term threat. But I think it's something that we should continue to stress and make people aware of that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, David, and everybody. Richard, Metra, this has been a really great discussion. I think we could keep going, but unfortunately we're out of time. But I want to thank you all, and thank you to our audience for joining us today for this really important discussion. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, panelists.